let's take a look at some more data. So just a quick little disclaimer ahead of this video. Scenery has changed from what you have just seen or what you are about to see. I haven't quite made the video just yet, but it is looking like a long boy, as in 50 plus minutes, edging onto 60 minutes. Now, I will always split this up into sections, so you can skip to whichever one you like. I will leave them time-stamped as a little contents page within YouTube, so you can skip to what you want to watch. But also, what I will trial for part number 3 and part number 4 for looking at the Hungary data, I will split it into a video for practice and qualifying together. I will then split it into a video for the race data. So then there will be 2 videos around 15 to 20 minutes long, so it won't be one long video. And then you'll just let me know which one you prefer, or let me know on this video whichever one you prefer. One long video which you can skip to whichever section you like, or 2 separate videos looking at the data independently. But there we go, that's the little disclaimer out the way. Enjoy what you're about to witness. Hello, my name is Alex Does F1 Stuff, and welcome back to part number 2 of this slightly different pilot series. And today we are going to be looking at the race weekend's data analysis for Styria, for the Styrian Grand Prix of 2020. Now, if you have not seen part 1 of this small little pilot series, I recommend you go and see that episode, as it kind of sets out the goals and the achievements of this little pilot series ahead of any of the races in 2021. But the general gist of this series is for you guys to give your feedback and your input into what this series should be about. I have already made some changes, and based on a few comments as well, I've made some changes from the previous episode. I've removed some things, I've changed up how I present them as well, and of course there are always more data analysis things that I can go into. Now, I've split this video up into 3 sections. Section number 1 will look at practice data, section number 2 will look at qualifying data, and section 3, which is the most important, will look at the race data, and that is where I'll go into the most depth as well. Feel free to skip to whichever section you would like. Depending on how long I spend on the teams in qualifying and practice, I may split that up into each individual team, but definitely for the race data analysis, I will be splitting it up into teams as well, so you can skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. And of course, at the very end of this video, we will be looking at all of the data combined and determining the driver of the weekend based on the practice, qualifying and race data presented in this video, and not of my opinions of how well they have performed in said race. Okay, I think that's enough waffle. Let's jump on into the race weekend's data analysis for Styria. And of course, we begin with the practice data. Now, for the Styrian Grand Prix, practice 3 was postponed due to the heavy rain. So we have the results for practice 1, which was topped by Sergio Perez from Max Verstappen and Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton. And then, of course, we have the results for practice 2, which this time was topped by Max Verstappen from Valtteri Bottas, the 2 racing points, Sainz and Hamilton. So the first thing I can do with this data is map on each of the team's times and see their progression through practice, and we end up with a graph that looks a little bit like this. The practice data progression, and we can see that Williams have made a significant improvement from practice 1 to practice 2 compared to everybody else. There are teams like Ferrari who haven't made much of an improvement, they're a bit of a horizontal line, and then we have Red Bull, who are actually the quickest team so far in FP1 and FP2. And then from this, I can simply determine their improvements as well, and we end up with a graph that looks a bit like this. Haas have made a 6/10 improvement from FP1 to FP2, all the way up to Williams making a 4-second improvement from FP1 to FP2. Now, of course, if FP3 was running, there would be 2 of these graphs side by side, and I'd be able to show you the improvement for each team from FP2 to FP3, but sadly, as FP3 did not run in Styria, that information is not available. And so chucking it back to the data, we head on into each individual team, and we begin with, of course, Mercedes. So we can isolate the Mercedes driver progression, and we can see that Valtteri Bottas was the driver that was constantly ahead of Lewis Hamilton. And we can see by how much. In FP2, it was 6.5 tenths in favour of Valtteri Bottas. However, FP1 was hugely close, just 0.03 of a second, with the next graph popping up being their head-to-head in each session so far this season. It is 1 apiece in FP1, it is 1 apiece in FP2, and in the only FP3 session run in Austria last round, it is 1-0 to Lewis Hamilton. And then in the bottom third of this section, I will pull up the FP1, 2 and 3 positions graphs. So we can see that in FP1 and FP2, Lewis Hamilton has had a first place, but then he has dropped down in the next round in Styria, and obviously no round running in Styria for FP3, so unfortunately just 1 dot each. And with this being the general pro forma for today's episode, it has slightly changed up as I've included the positional graphs, I've included the head-to-head as well, but if you feel like the head-to-head could be changed up, I can maybe stack the bars next to each other rather than on top of each other. I could possibly do a pie chart or something like that. Or alternatively, I could maybe squidge that one along and put in a average gap for FP1, FP2, FP3, so we can see how the gaps in this Grand Prix compare against each other. That could be something I could look at as well. Or if there's something else you feel that I have completely missed, then please let me know in the comments below and I will definitely take a look at that, as I have already taken on board some of the suggestions from the previous episode. But again, chucking it back to the data, we can apply this pro forma to Red Bull, and we end up with a panel that looks like this. Max Verstappen dominating Alex Albon in practice. It is 2-0 in the head-to-head in FP1 and FP2, as well as 1-0 in the only FP3 session so far this year, and he was 7 tenths, almost 8 tenths faster than Albon in both FP1 and FP2 this season, or this race. And then throwing it down onto McLaren, these were a lot closer. It is 1 apiece in FP2 in the head-to-head, 1-0 to Lando Norris in FP3 and 2-0 to Carlos Sainz in practice 1, with the largest gap being just 3 tenths. They were mightily close, the McLarens through practice. And then we have Racing Point, the team number 4. It is much the same as the McLaren practice session looking, however this is more dominant towards Sergio Perez. 2-0 in FP1, 2-0 in FP2 and 1-0 in the only FP3 session so far, with the smallest gap being just 3.5 tenths and the largest being half a second in front of Lance Stroll in FP1. Then we head to team number 5 and we have Renault. Now Daniel Ricciardo did not take part in FP2, so he only has the one time and he was 1 tenth ahead of Esteban Ocon in FP1. Now I have counted it as a 1-0 advantage to Ocon in FP2 in the head-to-head, simply because Ricciardo was there, he just didn't set a time as the session ran, so I've counted that towards Ocon, whereas if the session, like it is in Styria at the moment, if the session physically doesn't run, then I won't give a rank to it. But let me know if that's a bit unfair, the fact that Ricciardo didn't run, so then is it fair giving Ocon the advantage? I'm not sure, let me know. And then heading on into Ferrari, this is very even at the moment, albeit a mighty 9-tenth gap between Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel in FP2, but looking at the head-to-head, it is 1 apiece in both sessions, apart from FP3, as there has only been 1, and of course Sebastian Vettel was leading Charles Leclerc in FP1 this year. Vettel definitely had a much better opening portion of the season against Leclerc, and then it just went away from him from there. And then we head on into AlphaTauri and we see it is much the same as many other of the teams that we've seen so far, with a largest gap ahead for Pierre Gasly of just under 3 tenths of a second, and then 1 tenth of a second for FP1, with the head-to-head being 1 apiece in FP2. And then we have Alfa Romeo, and again, Antonio Giovinazzi, did not partake in FP1. And I've done something slightly different to Renault, so I have actually not counted the Giovinazzi not running in FP1 in favour of Kimi Räikkönen. Again, please let me know which one you think is more fair, whether I should still include the head-to-head battle if only one person partakes in the session. Let me know what you guys think. Then penultimately we have Haas, and Kevin Magnussen did not partake in FP1 either, and again, like Alfa Romeo, I have not included it as an advantage towards Grosjean, with a 3/10 advantage for Kevin Magnussen over Grosjean in FP2, and 2-0 so far in the head-to-head in practice 2 also. And then finally we head on in to Williams, and again George Russell did not partake in FP1, yet I have counted it towards Nicholas Latifi. I have very much chopped and changed it throughout this practice session so far, but it was just a 600th of a second gap between the two drivers in FP2 as well. And with Williams all concluded, that means we have concluded all of the practice data. Please let me know what you think should change, what I could add, what I could do differently, or what I could highlight also. So we move on into the qualifying data for the Styrian Grand Prix, and we start with the results. So we head on into Q1. It is topped by Lewis Hamilton from Max Verstappen and the two McLarens, and out is Kimi Raikkonen, Sergio Perez, Latifi, Giovinazzi and Grosjean, who failed to set a time. Then of course we have Q2, which is out is Leclerc, Russell, Stroll, Kvyat and Magnussen, and then finally Q3, it is topped by Lewis Hamilton, 1.2 seconds clear from Max Verstappen, all the way down to Sebastian Vettel in P10. And so very similarly to the practice data, I can map on each of these times and we can see a qualifying progression, which looks something like this. It progresses nicely as each team makes some sort of progression towards Q2, and then everybody loses time going into Q3, but of course it was a heavily rain-affected qualifying. And then again, very similarly to the practice data, I can identify and highlight each team's improvements as well, and we end up with two graphs that look a bit like this. So the most improved from Q1 to Q2, Renault and McLaren made just half a tenth gain from Q1 to Q2, with Alfa Tauri being the only team to gain 1 second. However, going from Q2 to Q3, everybody lost time. Red Bull lost 2.5 seconds, then Alfa Tauri and McLaren both lost 2.2, Racing Point 2.1 along with Ferrari, and Mercedes lost the least in 1.4 seconds. Now again, there's not really much you can draw from this as it was a rain-affected race. I'm not 100% sure what I fully understand from this data, but it's cool to see it. And then applying the pro forma for the practice head-to-head between each of the teammates, we can apply all of the qualifying data to that same pro forma, and we end up with something that looks a bit like this. We have the Mercedes qualifying progression, and we can see that for each session, Q1, 2 and 3, Lewis Hamilton was much faster than Valtteri Bottas. How much faster? On average, around 8 tenths of a second. 6 tenths in Q1, 8 tenths in Q2, and then a whopping 1.4 in Q3, with the head-to-head so far being a dead heat. 1 apiece in Q1, 1 apiece in Q2, and 1 apiece in Q3. As if we remember, in Austria, it was Valtteri Bottas who led all 3 sessions in qualifying. And then very similarly, I can highlight their positions graphs here, and honestly, each of them look identical. Q2 and Q3 is identical, and then if it wasn't for Hamilton being P3 in Q1 and then Valtteri Bottas being P5 in Q1 also, they'd have 3 identical positions graphs, which I suppose is a testament to Mercedes' consistency. But once again, throwing this back into Red Bull and applying the same logic, we can see that there was an enormous gap between Albon and Max in Q1, 2.5 seconds. However, that gap did shrink. Unlike Mercedes, it increased as the sessions went on. Red Bull's has decreased to half a second. However, it is not quite a whitewash in qualifying like it is in practice for Max Verstappen, as in Q2, Albon has 1 and Max has 1. And then looking at McLaren, we can see a small crossover, as Lando Norris was leading in Q1 and Q2 by just under a tenth in Q1 and then just under 4 tenths in Q2. However, Carlos Sainz managed to get the better of him by 2.5 tenths in Q3. It is 1 apiece in Q1 and Q3 for the two McLarens, with it being 2-0 in Q2 towards Lando Norris. Then we have Racing Point up next, and they had a doozy, an absolute doozy in qualifying, with Lance Stroll just making it through 1.9 seconds faster than Sergio Perez in Q1, who was knocked out. And then Stroll making it into Q2 didn't progress any further than that. And then we move on into Renault, and we see that it is much the same, if not the kind of reverse of McLaren. We have Daniel Ricciardo leading Esteban Ocon in Q1, and then Esteban Ocon leading Ricciardo in the final 2 sessions. Just 0.02 split the two Renaults in Q1, then almost half a second in Q2, and Ricciardo managed to bring it down only just to 2.7 tenths of a second. However, Ricciardo does maintain his head-to-head battle in Q1, as it is currently 2-0. And then we head on into the Scarlet team of Ferrari, and again this is much closer than people first imagine. Vettel really did have a strong start to this season. It is 1 apiece in the head-to-head for Q1 and also Q2, and I've just realised that Leclerc has been scored a point in the head-to-head for Q3. However, neither driver has actually made it through to Q3 together, so that shouldn't be there. It should be a blank blank box for Q3. As if we just look at the positions, the Q3 positions graph, which I've also realised I've left the headers on. The headers are just supposed to be on the far left. There is only 2 dots separated in Austria and Styria. And then we head on into Alfa Tauri for a very interesting looking graph. We see an enormous gain from Pierre Gasly from Q1 to Q2, but almost nothing from Danny Kvyat from Q1 to Q2. He had a 3.5 gap to Gasly in Q1, giving him a 1-all advantage in the head-to-head. However, it switched to an almost second gap to Q2, as he just couldn't improve on his time at all, whereas Gasly managed to find an enormous amount of pace. Then heading to the second Alfa team, we go to Alfa Romeo, and these are just 2 dots. We have Giovinazzi being the top dot, and then we have Kimi Räikkönen being the bottom dot. It is 1 apiece in the Q1 battle, as neither car so far has made it into Q2, with the gap being just half a second. And then penultimately we have Haas, and this is again much the same, as Romain Grosjean failed to start the session in Q1. He did not set any times, so it is still 1-0 to Grosjean actually in Q1 and 1-0 to Magnussen in Q2, with no gaps, as Magnussen was the only Haas car to set a time. And then finally we have Williams also, and Nicholas Latifi was knocked out in Q1, with George Russell progressing into Q2, and of course it is 2-0 to George Russell, but with the benefit of hindsight we know that that will be maintained throughout, and he will always have a whitewash against Nicholas Latifi. And so with all of the qualifying data done and dusted, we head on in to today's race data, and the race data for Styria. So looking at the race results, actually we begin with that first. It is a race that was won by Lewis Hamilton quite convincingly from Valtteri Bottas, and the Mercedes won it very convincingly ahead of the 2 Red Bulls. However, what did this look like in terms of a position chart? So let's have a look at that right now for Styria. As we see everybody filling in, we get to a manic stage of pit stops in the middle, with lots of people changing positions throughout the midfield. However, the 2 Mercedes managed to stay put all the way at the bottom, but Max Verstappen managed to split them until a pit stop at the end, where he lost it towards to Valtteri Bottas. Definitely need to work on my commentating skills. That's 100% something I need to improve on. But also another way of presenting this data, we can take a look at the lap chart for Styria. Now, of course, we had the safety car incident where the 2 Ferraris crashed into each other, which is the first enormous peak where they were well over 2 minutes in lap time at the start. However, racing resumed very quickly on from that, and we then had the first stage of pit stops, a middle stage, then the late pit stops, and then the 2 on the far right-hand side are the fastest lap pit stops for Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen. But just zooming in on this section so we can have a closer look at all of that, we can see there are a couple of bands of racing. Now, what I mean by a band of racing is normally we have this long line, this long thread or this rope kind of thing that I talk about, and that is all of the drivers together. But normally we can see sort of splitting off or separating of this big chunk of lines, and we can see it in different bands. I highlighted it quite well in the previous video, but this one is a lot harder to see. Now, of course, the first one that is very plain and obvious is this one between the 2 blue arrows, and this is the 2 Mercedes and Max Verstappen, and this lasts for near enough half of the race. It pops up a touch from about laps 48 on to about laps 66, 67 sort of time, but it is 100% clear as day to see this is a separate band of racing from the rest of the field. Then between these 2 green arrows we have the second band of racing, as it is all mushed into one. Everyone apart from the 2 Mercedes and Max Verstappen are in this field, and they are very hard to indistinguish. However, after the second green arrow we have these bands of racing here with the 3 yellow arrows. They split quite nicely into 3 individual threads of racing. So at this stage, in line with the yellow arrows, we have 4 groups. We have the 2 Mercedes and Max Verstappen, we then have the group just behind that, then we have the second to last group, and then we have the 2 runners at the back with the top yellow arrow. Then between these 2 red arrows, it sort of mushes back to 1. Possibly you can identify maybe 2, possibly even 3 different bands of racing in that, but it is very, very difficult to see. And then again, at the very end, slightly more difficult to see, with these 3 red arrows, we have 3 different bands of racing. Now, generally what I expect to see is 3 bands of racing, as we have the top couple of teams, Mercedes and Red Bull, we then have the midfield, and then of course we have the back markers as well. However, in Austria we had 4. The midfield was almost split into 2. We had the upper midfield and we had the lower midfield, and that's something that we see sometimes popping up, and definitely we see it more clearly in other races, as this one for Styria was very, very difficult to see and actually pinpoint exactly where the different bands occur and where they mush back together into one. It is much, much clearer to see it in the Austria data. However, I have split up all of this data into, once again, teammate battles, and we start with Mercedes, and we pull up the Mercedes lap time chart, and it fills in for Lewis Hamilton first in the black line and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise line, and we can see that they are very, very even this race. There isn't really a particular point where one car is very much faster than the other. Very much faster? Jesus Christ. However, one addition that I have made is I've gone back to the 2019 data, and I've gone back to Austria and picked out the fastest car, or the fastest Mercedes car in Austria 2019, which was Valtteri Bottas. And in this grey dotted line, I have mapped on his lap times, and you can see consistently Mercedes of 2020 is at least half a second faster, if not in some places an entire second faster per lap than their 2019 car this year. That is absolutely phenomenal progress that they have made. And this was a suggestion that was made by a commenter as well, just seeing how we can compare this to the previous year's data to see their progression over time. So this is something that I've managed to change and apply to every single teammate battle that we will look at today. Then underneath this, I can map on their gaps as well, and we end up with a graph that looks a bit like this. Lewis Hamilton leading for 2 portions of the race, and Valtteri Bottas leading briefly in the middle section of this Grand Prix as well. And you can see that the gaps increase over time as Valtteri Bottas's gaps to Lewis Hamilton decreases as time progresses. And then we can just quickly map on their positions chart, and this just shows where exactly they were and which position they were on what lap of the Grand Prix. And then finally we have this graph here, the percentage pace difference, Hamilton to Bottas. And the way that I have worked out this is I've just lined up each lap time aside. I've then calculated a percentage depending on who was faster. Was it Lewis Hamilton or was it Valtteri Bottas? And I've worked out the percentages based on Lewis Hamilton. So Lewis Hamilton's lap times are always the denominator and Valtteri Bottas's lap times are always the numerator. I've then ordered those percentages from Lewis Hamilton's highest down to Valtteri Bottas's lowest, if that makes sense. And so visualizing this data, we can plot on Lewis Hamilton's lap times and we can plot on Valtteri Bottas's lap times. And then of course we can split this down the middle and we can determine that for 47.9% of this race and 47.9% of the laps raced, Valtteri Bottas was the quicker Mercedes, so therefore 52.1% Hamilton was the faster of the Mercedes duo. But turning our focus now to the 2 graphs on the left, I can highlight this section here in between the 2 blue arrows, and this is where Hamilton was going considerably quicker than Valtteri Bottas, and this correlates to his gap of just below 8 seconds. It then plummeted all the way down to nothing as the safety car was called out. Then there was this section of racing between the 2 yellow arrows in which they were much for muchness. Hamilton was going a squidge quicker, which is evident from this section of their gaps chart as well, which shows it nicely progressing just above 8 seconds all the way until Lewis Hamilton took his pit stop. I've also highlighted Valtteri Bottas's pit stop as well. However, upon pitting first, Lewis Hamilton relinquished his lead to Valtteri Bottas, and Valtteri Bottas ended up with a 12-second lead. However, it fell all the way down to 4 by the time he took his pit stop. And that is also shown in the positions charts just here on the right, where Valtteri Bottas took the lead just briefly for a couple of laps until he stopped. However, directly after Hamilton's pit stop, he took full advantage of his new fresh tyres and he was able to go considerably quicker than Valtteri Bottas before his pit stop, which is seen in the steep decline of Valtteri Bottas's gap over Lewis Hamilton. And it also correlates to the gap where Lewis Hamilton retakes the lead. It is now considerably higher, roughly 4 seconds faster than where he entered the pit stop against Valtteri Bottas. So he secured what is known as the undercut over Valtteri Bottas. Then not much else happened in this graph apart from this section here where Valtteri Bottas is just just quicker than Lewis Hamilton, and that is evident in this section here where he closes the gap from just over 14 seconds to just under 12. But other than that, not much else happened in the Mercedes graph. And then applying all of this data over to Red Bull, we can take a look at what this looks like. So we start, of course, with their lap chart. Max Verstappen goes in first, and then Alex Albon in the darker line goes in second. And then we can map on in the grey dotted line the fastest Red Bull 2019 time, which was, of course, Max Verstappen. And we can see they have not made much of an improvement, especially compared to Mercedes. In the second half of the race, they were much the same as their 2019 pace, and in the first half of the race, it was only Max Verstappen that was faster than their 2019 car. And then just like the Mercedes graph, we can plot on their gaps as well. So Max Verstappen was always the Red Bull driver in front, escalating his gap over Albon to over 40 seconds. We can then map on their positions chart as well, which looks something like this in the top right. And then of course we can map on their pace percentage difference graph as well, which shows a distribution that looks like this. Which, if we split this line down the middle, we can see that for 31.0% of the laps raced, Alex Albon was the faster of the Red Bulls, and then for 69.0% of the laps, Max Verstappen was the faster of the two Red Bulls. So again, turning our attention to the two graphs on the left, we can highlight this first section between the two blue arrows where Max Verstappen was at times a full second faster than Alex Albon for the first 20-ish laps, maybe 25 laps. And that is shown by this steep increase. It doesn't look particularly steep, but that's because the graph goes all the way up to 45 seconds, compared to the Mercedes graph, which only went up to about 10 or 15 or something like that. And he extended his gap all the way over the 20-second margin. And again, we see this decrease in his gap at the very beginning, which was caused by the safety car. He managed to extend in the opening laps to just over 5 seconds, and that was cut all the way down to roughly 1.15 seconds as well. But it was Max Verstappen who took a very early pit stop, much earlier than most, and that sliced his gap all the way down to below 5 seconds, but he was still able to maintain his lead. He was then also able to take full advantage of his brand new tyres between these two yellow arrows, which managed to extend his gap all the way back up to about 10 to 15 seconds. Alex Albon was the next driver to come into the pits, and that is then shown in the steep increase in the gap all the way back to about 35 seconds. So again, Max Verstappen took full advantage of the undercut and was able to extend his 20-second gap before the pit stops to a 35-second gap after the pit stops. And you can very clearly see the impact that Albon's pit stop had, as if we look at the positions chart, he lost considerable amounts of places. He lost 4 places due to his pit stop and then had to fight those back as well, which he did manage to do, probably courtesy of other people's pit stops also. Then between the two green arrows, we have another section of the race where Max Verstappen is a little quicker than Alex Albon, but unfortunately Albon, even after the pit stop, can't take advantage of his fresh tyres over Verstappen. And that is shown in this section of the gaps chart here, where it sort of gently increases from just over 35 seconds to just over 40. However, the significant impact is Max Verstappen's early pit stop meant his tyres were degrading very, very quickly. And then we have this section where Alex Albon was almost a second and at times well over a second faster than Verstappen. And that is courtesy of this short decrease here in the gap, down to roughly 35 seconds, just below 35 seconds. However, the cause of the steep decrease in time is a second pit stop for Max Verstappen in order to grab the fastest lap of the race, which is this steep decrease in the gap, as Alex Albon was able to gain 20 seconds due to Max Verstappen's pit stop. However, moving from Red Bull and heading over to McLaren, we can see that they had a very marginal gain over their 2019 lap times. They had a very big gain in the second half of the race, however the first half it was much the same. But again, splitting the percentage pace difference graph down the middle, we can see that for 42.9% of the laps that they ran together, it was Carlos Sainz that was the faster of the two McLarens, and therefore for 57.1% of the laps, it was Lando Norris who was once again the faster McLaren. But turning our attention to the two graphs on the left, I can highlight this first section between the two blue arrows once again, and it is also a marginal benefit for Carlos Sainz, which is shown in their gaps chart from increasing the gap over Lando Norris from 5 seconds to just under 10 seconds. However, within this chart, we can see that Lando Norris had a small little mistake, roughly around lap 15, where he lost about 1 or 2 seconds over Carlos Sainz, and that is shown in this tiny steep increase in the gap here, from just below 5 seconds to roughly 6 to 7 seconds. However, a little bit further down the line, and still between the two blue arrows, we have this here, where he managed to put in a mega lap. And then looking at the gaps chart, that is shown by this small little decrease in the gap. However, in the grand scheme of things, it's still increased between the two blue arrows. Then Carlos Sainz is the first McLaren to pit, shown by these two steep increased blue lines here, which is shown on the positions chart with him losing, position 5 down to position 13. He lost 8 positions in his pit stop phase. And this pit stop did mean that Carlos Sainz was no longer the lead McLaren, which is evident by this little void in the graph here, and Lando Norris jumping to a well over 15-second gap over Carlos Sainz just after his pit stop. However, what could be a little bit unclear to see is that even throughout this pit stop phase, Lando Norris managed to put in some decent laps, and he managed to keep this gap sort of consistent, but Carlos Sainz did take advantage of the new tyres shortly after his pit stop, but not straight away, which did cause this nice little decrease in Lando Norris's first gap. Norris then came into the pits just a couple of laps later in this light blue line here, which is then shown between these two sections here. He didn't lose anywhere near as many places, but he still lost a position to Carlos Sainz, which is also shown by this little void here and the gap changing once again. But then between these two pink lines, we can see that Lando Norris massively took advantage of this new tyre advantage, and he was consistently quicker than Carlos Sainz every single lap. There wasn't a lap from after his pit stop to just at the end of the race before Carlos Sainz made his fastest lap pit stop where Sainz was faster. There wasn't a case at all, and that is clearly evident in the gap decreasing significantly from just below 10 seconds to just over 1 second. Sainz then obviously pulled in for his second pit stop of the race and to go for that fastest lap, which is shown just here as they crossed over once again, so it wasn't too big of a detriment to Sainz in the first place, and it also enabled the gap to shoot well above 25 seconds in this nice steep line here. Then heading on into Racing Point, we can see that from their 2019 lap times, they actually gained similar to Mercedes. They have made big steps forward this year, but equally, that's because they slightly copied the Mercedes car, and their 2019 car was a bit of a dog. I wouldn't say they gained as much as Mercedes, but definitely in the last third, maybe last half of the race, they at some points gained well over 1.5 seconds compared to their 2019 car. But splitting their percentage pace difference graph down the middle, we can see that for 28.2% of the laps that they were running together, Lance Stroll was the faster of the two Racing Points, and for 71.8%, it was Sergio Perez. But again, turning our attention to the two graphs on the left, I can highlight this massive chunk between the two blue arrows where nothing happens. They were literally dead even on laps 15 where they both had slow laps. They then both recovered as well, and that is seen so very clearly in their gaps. It is as straight a line as you could hope for. The gap just stays consistently between around 2 seconds and 1.5 seconds for the majority of this race. It isn't until Lance Stroll comes into the pits first where he relinquishes that lead to Sergio Perez, and that is shown just here in this massive steep increase where the gap goes to just under 20 seconds, and then there is also this crossover here on their positions chart. Sergio Perez was able to keep pace with the newly pitted Lance Stroll as well between these two light green arrows, which is evident by the gap not really decreasing until Sergio Perez makes his pit stop, which is in this dark green arrow here, and then of course the gap comes down significantly, which is shown in this void here. And again it stays at just around 1 second after Perez comes back out again. And we can see that change on the positions chart just here as they cross over once again. Then between these two blue-yellow lines, it is Sergio Perez taking advantage of his brand new fresh tyres, and that is this small little decrease in the gap over Lance Stroll, all the way down to just over 0 seconds. Or just under 1 second, I should say. That sounds a bit better. Then between these two red arrows, it is Sergio Perez who manages to get past Lance Stroll in the race, and from there he doesn't look back, and he is monumentally quicker, and at some points 1 second a lap quicker than Lance Stroll, and that is evident by this enormously steep increase. That is just on pure pace, from under 5 seconds to well over 15 in the last 20 or so laps of the Grand Prix. But if you remember, at the very end of this Grand Prix, Perez had a small dink with Albon at the end, and he ended up losing a bunch of positions on the line. And that is this massive steep increase in his lap chart here, and then that is shown by his gap dropping significantly to Lance Stroll to being just over 0 seconds at the flag. Literally just over 0 seconds. It was a couple hundredths at the flag. And so leaving Racing Point, we head on into team number 5, and that is Renault. And Renault have made significant gains, especially in the first 2/3 of Austria, at one point gaining over a second a lap on their previous 2019 lap time. Now, Esteban Ocon did end up retiring halfway through around lap 25, but we can still analyse some of this data. So splitting up their percentage pace difference, we can see down the middle that it was 48% of the laps that they were racing together were in favour of Esteban Ocon, compared to 52.0% in favour of Mr. Daniel Ricciardo. Now we can highlight the first section of racing between these two blue arrows along here on their lap chart, which basically shows how equal they were, and that is shown by their gap here, by the Renault's gap chart as well, that it's basically hovering between 1.5 and just below half a second on lap number 3, but again, that was because of the safety car. There is, however, just here in the green arrow, a small mistake by Esteban Ocon, which ultimately leads to a positional change, which is shown here in the gap chart from where Esteban Ocon was leading to where Daniel Ricciardo ended up leading, which again is shown here in the crossover on their positions chart. This was not due to a pit stop, this was an on-track overtake. Then between these two darker green lines, we have the two Renaults running basically the same pace once again. However, they have swapped and Daniel Ricciardo is ahead, as shown by the two darker green lines, now highlighting the gap ahead of Ocon that Ricciardo has, which again is still below 1 second. The consistency of these two Renaults fighting through the field has been very, very strong. However, then comes Esteban Ocon's retirement, as denoted by this single steep increased line. If it was a double, he would have ended up coming back down and coming towards racing pace, but as it is a single, it is due to a retirement, which corresponds to this steep increase in the gap to well above 4.5 seconds, and it is also shown here on the positions chart, where he falls down to position 9 and stops at that point. And other than that, there isn't anything else we can pull apart from this Renault data. So we move on into Ferrari, and there's, well, even less. There's nothing, as Vettel ended up retiring on lap number 1 due to his rear wing damage, and Leclerc managed just a couple of pitiful laps to about lap 5. That's all the difference and all the data that I can pull. We have a nice dotted line with not a great deal of detail from the last year, and that's it. So leaving Ferrari, we head on into Alfa Tauri, and here there is a lot of data that we can talk about. And once again, their 2020 car is much the same. Much the same as their 2019 car. However, splitting up their percentage pace difference graph down the middle, we can see that 47.1% of the laps where they raced together were in favour of Daniel Kvyat, compared to 52.9% in favour of Gasly. But moving now to the two graphs on the left, we can highlight this section between these first two blue arrows, where they are pretty much the same together, and that is shown by this nice horizontal line in their gap chart, consistently around 4 to 5 seconds. However, Gasly ended up going on a poor run of laps. For 2 laps, he was in this above 71 seconds. That's a minute 11 lap times, where Danny Kvyat is happily in the minute 10s, the low minute 10s, which ultimately ends up in the gap coming down. Gasly is still ahead, but the gap is now coming down. And it's not until Gasly ends up making his pit stop, highlighted in this darker green arrow here, in which they actually end up passing, highlighted by this green arrow on the gaps chart, where Kvyat ends up taking the lead in terms of the AlphaTauri battle. It's also shown just here in the crossover as well, as Gasly loses or goes down from position 11 all the way to position 18. Then after Gasly's first pit stop, we can see just between these two sort of orangey arrows that he doesn't take advantage of the fresher tyres. He's still on the same pace as Danny Kvyat, which is represented just here by this gap staying around 20 seconds. Normally, after a pit stop, we would expect the first car to pit to go faster and to close down that gap and take advantage of the undercuts, but that just hasn't worked for AlphaTauri. We then see just up here that Danny Kvyat comes in for his pit stop, and it is shown here on the positions chart on the right hand side, where he again loses a fair chunk of places, going from P8 down to P14, so a very similar place amount to Pierre Gasly, but he is physically higher up the grid by the time he pits. And then very clearly after Kvyat's pit stop here between the two yellow arrows, he does take advantage of the pit stop or the fresher tyres, unlike Pierre Gasly, which is corresponded here. So after Gasly takes the lead in AlphaTauri battle, after Kvyat's pit stop, Kvyat clearly closes that gap down, which is something that Gasly didn't do or wasn't able to do. We then, however, have a second pit stop for Mr. Pierre Gasly, which absolutely ruins his race. He would have possibly scored some points this time out, but this really did ruin him. However, just here, just before, we actually have a small mistake. This is the lap before his pit stop, or even 2 laps before. He doesn't quite get there, and he loses buckets and buckets of time. And the culmination of these two peaks basically ends up in this sharp increase in the AlphaTauri gap to well above 25 seconds. There is then this section highlighted in the light grey arrows, where after his second pit stop, Gasly does sort of perform, but again we see two sort of mistakes. There are two peaks in that graph, so the average ends up basically not really being there, and that is shown in the gaps chart as well. The gap stays above 25 seconds. It increases and it decreases, but it never goes below 25 seconds. And leaving AlphaTauri, we now head to Alfa Romeo, and I was very surprised that they have actually made some gains on their 2019 pace, especially in terms of the Austria track that we are looking at today. Especially in the last quarter, they've gained about half a second on their 2019 pace. The first 2/3, maybe 2/3 even, it's about the same, maybe 2/10, 3/10 quicker here or there, but not bad. I was expecting them to be slower than their 2019 pace. But as always, we start with the percentage pace difference and we split this down the middle, and we see that 45.7% of the laps raced together were in favour of Giovinazzi, compared to 54.3% in favour of Raikkonen. And again, we can highlight the first section of racing between these two blue arrows where not a great deal of stuff happens, and that is again shown in the gaps chart by this nice horizontal line which pokes just above 3 seconds and comes down to about 1 second also. However, there is this sort of mistake that comes from Mr. Kimi Raikkonen. He has a 1 minute 11 lap, a 71 second lap, whilst the pace is roughly around 70 seconds. And that is shown by this short little increase in the gap. It was nicely coming down as Raikkonen was gaining and gaining and gaining. He makes a mistake and it pokes back up closer to 3 seconds again. Then we have a pit stop. The first one is for Giovinazzi, which is shown just here in the gaps chart, where Kimi Raikkonen ends up getting past, which again is shown just here on the positions chart, with the gap going up towards 21 seconds. Then just a couple of laps after that, after Giovinazzi is making some ground with the new tyres, Kimi Raikkonen comes in for his pit stop, and again we have this nice little void as the guards changes and Giovinazzi once again takes the lead in the Alfa Romeo battle, which is shown just here on their positions chart. And then the next section of racing just after Raikkonen's pit stop in the two light blue arrows shows that he didn't take advantage. This has been a trend throughout Austria and throughout Styria in particular, that not a lot of drivers were able to take advantage over their teammate on their fresher tyres, which is something that is very, very interesting. And that again correlates to this horizontal line here. There's a little bit of a peak in there which comes from a Giovinazzi mistake, which you can see just underneath the dark green arrow. However, the next thing to point out is a very important mistake from Giovinazzi here in the red. It's a little bit difficult to see, but it is actually the shaded line that we are following, not the dotted line. The dotted line is their previous year's pace. And this lap time of just over 70 seconds, when the pace is around 69, is very, very costly. And you can see here on the positions chart, it ultimately led to a swap in the positions. Raikkonen was able to get past. This wasn't a pit stop, this wasn't anything like that, this was an on-track overtake due to Giovinazzi's mistake. And again, we can then highlight the final section of racing, where not a great deal happens, but Giovinazzi has one final little peak, which again is a big mistake, worse than the one highlighted in red, which is shown in a steep increase here in the two grey lines on their gaps chart. Then penultimately, we can take a look at Haas, and again Haas is a very interesting one as they make very minimal gains from their 2019 car. A little bit in the middle portion of the race, probably half a second, stretching towards a second on some laps, and then in the last third from about laps 51 onwards they make about half a second gain, but honestly not too much at all. But again, we start with the percentage pace difference from Magnussen to Grosjean, which I've forgotten to close the brackets, but that is not the end of the world. We split this down the middle, and we see that for the first time this season, it is a 50-50 split. They were both equal, they both did an even number of laps, and they were both as fast as each other, which is very much shown by their lap chart. It is extremely equal. But of course, we can highlight some sections. So this first one between the two blue arrows shows that Grosjean is actually considerably faster than Magnussen. However, if we highlight the section on the gaps chart, it is Magnussen that is ahead, but the gap is coming down from just over 6 seconds to well under 1 second. And before we even enter the pit stop stages, they actually swap places, highlighted by this green arrow here. This is again an on-track overtake. They swap places, which again, looking at the gaps chart, is represented by this change of the guard, the line changing from Magnussen's grey to Grosjean's white. And then Grosjean goes on a nice run between these two green lines of going a little bit quicker than Kevin Magnussen, managing to extend his lead. There is a nice little peak in between these two light green arrows on the gaps chart. However, you can probably already see it, there is 2 mistakes. Not on consecutive laps, probably it's about 4 laps, maybe 5 laps, but there are 2 large, probably second mistakes that he is making, 1.5 second mistakes that he is making to Magnussen, which ultimately ends up in another pass here. It brings down the gap to well under a second. He's working so hard to improve that gap, and he makes 2 costly errors. And just like I said, there is a second on-track pass before we get to the pit stop stages, highlighted in the second dark green arrow on the positions chart, which again is highlighted by the change of the guards that Magnussen is now the lead Haas car. Then finally we get to the first pit stop stages, and it is Magnussen who comes in first by this red arrow here, which shoots the gap towards Grosjean's favour all the way up to about 20 seconds. We then have Grosjean that comes in the orange line a couple of laps after, and again Magnussen retakes the lead, but his gap is now just over 6 seconds, so once again he has taken advantage of the undercut, extending his gap before the pit stop of roughly just over a second to over 6 seconds. But the section directly after Grosjean's pit stop, highlighted between these 2 light grey arrows, shows that he now takes advantage of his fresh tyres, and he pulls this gap down from just over 6 seconds to exactly where it was before the pit stop stages. But again, another costly mistake highlighted here in the light blue from Kevin Magnussen, costing him about 2 seconds, leads to another positional change. Grosjean manages to get past again for the 3rd time on track that wasn't to do with pit stops. And then once he is passed on the final section of the race, we end up between these 2 black lines where they are very equal, but the gap is basically non-existent. It's around a second, just under a second. But then if you think this story couldn't get any crazier, there is yet another mistake, and another mistake again from Grosjean. There are 2, just one more to the right of this sort of darker orange line here, which once again cost them another positional change, and Magnussen ends up beating Grosjean to the line. There were 4 Haas lead changes in this Grand Prix that were nothing to do with pit stops. The absolutely closest pair that we could have had this Grand Prix. And then finally we take a look at Williams. Now this is a lot more interesting than their previous one from Austria, but again, you'd have thought they'd have made significant gains from last year. It definitely feels like it, but they really haven't. They haven't made significant gains. Every now and then it's about half a second a lap, but it's more like 0.2 to 0.3 when you average everything out at the very end. But of course, turning our attention to the percentage pace difference, we split this down the middle and we see that 42% of the laps raced together are in favour of Latifi, compared to 58% in favour of Russell. But the first interesting thing to highlight is Russell managed to pit in the first safety car window, which is highlighted on the positions chart this time. We start over on the right hand side between these two blue arrows, and he loses a whole heap of places. He worked so hard to get a good qualifying and then pitted under the safety car and lost it, and that was it. That was the end of his race. But now moving over to the two charts on the left, we can highlight this section between the two green arrows where they are very, very, very equal. And again, that is seen in the gaps chart. But Nicholas Latifi, after Russell's pit stop, is the lead Williams. But the gap comes down from about 4 seconds to about 2 seconds. But from about lap 7 to lap 31, it stays at 2 seconds. We then have a pit stop. The first one is from Nicholas Latifi, which shows a changing of the guard, and George Russell manages to get past, extending the lead to 16 seconds. But then immediately after, literally just a couple of laps after, George Russell comes in for his pit stop, and then again Nicholas Latifi ends up getting past and again takes advantage of his fresher tyres and does a small undercut, extending his lead before the pit stops from 2 seconds to just over 4 seconds after the pit stops. And then directly after George Russell's pit stop, we can highlight this section in yellow here. And for the first couple of laps, he definitely takes advantage and slices down Nicholas Latifi's gap, which is shown here. It comes down very, very quickly from 4 seconds to well under 2 seconds, around 1 second. But he can't really do anything until this mistake here in the slightly darker orange colour from Nicholas Latifi, allowing for a positional change on track to happen, which again is the only positional change on track that happens for Williams. And then of course we have the final section of racing between these two darker grey arrows here, which shows that George Russell is in front, but it is very uppy downy, both drivers not being entirely consistent whatsoever, which is shown here. The gap is just all over the place. It is very, very undulating, with ultimately this peak here in the black and the second peak to the right of this black arrow as well, culminating in this steep increase in the gap from about 2 seconds to just over 6. And so there we go, all of the race data for Styria is concluded. My god, this is a very long video at the moment. It's bordering on 50 to 60 minutes. That is absolutely crazy. I will definitely put a disclaimer in saying I can split this up into 2 separate videos, but I have one final thing to look at, and that is the driver of the weekend. Now, I have slightly changed the driver of the weekend thing from when I last did it. I'm now looking at 28 main categories, each with their own subcategories. I can't be bothered to add them all up. It's several hundred ultimate categories that I'm looking at so far. But there are 28 main categories. There are 15 that look at your performances versus your teammate across the whole weekend, practice data, qualifying data, race data. And then there are 13 that look at your own individual performances, excluding your teammate, so we can sort of get a balanced look at how well you've done on your own and how well you did against your teammate versus the entire grid. So we will now jump on into the driver of the weekend section of this video, and we start with the individual performances, and these are the 13 main categories, each with their own subcategory. I'm not going to delve into it in this episode whatsoever, as it is massively long, but the overall order for the individual performances for Styria across practice, qualifying and the race looks a bit like this. Lewis Hamilton was declared the best individual driver, from Max Verstappen, from Valtteri Bottas, from Sergio, from Ricciardo, Norris, Ocon, Sainz, etc., down towards Giovinazzi. However, there is a second half to this, and this is of course the teammate performances, and these are the 15 main categories. Again, each of them has their own set of subcategories that are ranked and averaged out, etc. And for the teammate battles, we end up with an order that looks something like this. Max Verstappen leads the teammate ranks, from George Russell, from Charles Leclerc, from Lewis Hamilton, from Sergio Perez, Raikkonen, Magnussen, Gasly, Sainz, Ricciardo, Ocon, etc., all the way down to Albon at the back. And then from this order, I've just assigned a rank 1 through 20 for your own individual performance, a rank 1 through 20 for your own teammate performance, and then I've averaged those two ranks out together to determine the best driver of Styria across the practice data, across the qualifying data, and across the race data, and I've ended up with an order that looks a little something like this. It is declared that Max Verstappen was the driver of the weekend, from Lewis Hamilton, from Sergio Perez, from Charles Leclerc, Daniel Ricciardo, and then Carlos Sainz, closely followed by Esteban Ocon, with Bottas, Norris, and Russell on 9.5, all equal, and then the two Haas cars are equal on 11.5, then Raikkonen, Kvyat, Gasly, Latifi, Stroll, Albon, Vettel, and finally Giovinazzi. And there we go, that is the end of part number 2 for this little pilot series for the race data analysis. Now I know it has been a long one, it is extremely long, so thank you so much for watching if you have sat through all of this, or if you have skipped to whichever section you did want to watch. But if you have any ideas for improvements or ways you can see how this series can be improved, please let me know in the comments below, as that is exactly what this series is for, and that is what it is designed to do. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.